solidarity contest. In the Palestine solidarity context, where we won a case that was brought by members of the American Studies Association against its former leaders and the American Studies Association after it passed a boycott in 2013 of Israeli academic institutions. So a version of this lawsuit was first filed in 2016, and then just last week, the DC Superior Court dismissed all of the claims, saying that they arose out of advocacy and were meritless. So we use the DC anti-SLAPP law in that context to dismiss these claims. So anyway, this was a major victory for advocates and around human rights in Palestine. I think it's really important to sort of be supporting organizers and advocates using our legal tools in the civil context as well, because those types of lawsuits can be really draining. I think another sort of category of using legal tools that, you know, attorneys at CCR and elsewhere, of course, have used is sort of challenging the laws, not necessarily just in an individual context, but broadly when you see these patterns, sort of challenging the laws that are used to criminalize or otherwise silence organizers and activists. And I can say a little bit more about the critical infrastructure law in Louisiana that we've been challenging at CCR, somewhat relevant to the Stop Cop City protests too. And then just another bucket of work that, you know, folks like Palestine Legal and NLG engage in are sort of know your rights trainings and advising folks around, you know, how the law protects them, which I think is a really important element of the work. And one thing that I wanted to say about challenges, I think there's like a lot of challenges and limitations that we all are probably aware of, given sort of the inherent conservative nature of like the legal system. But just one thought on sort of being a lawyer working with organizers and advocates is that lawyers tend to be kind of risk averse. And in the First Amendment and like speech context, there's a risk of that risk averseness chilling the speech that we're trying to enable and facilitate, right? So, and on the other hand, it's also really important to be clear and honest with our clients about like, what is the limit of what the law protects and what are the risks that our clients and partners are facing with the plans that they have. So I think just this question of how do you lawyer in this context in a way that is enabling and also truthful and helpful in terms of providing legal advice.
That was super helpful. What came to my mind while you were talking was some of the things that I see as challenges as someone who lives in a red state, where like some of these same like arguments that are supposed to support like, you know, these kind of progressive movements are like utilized so heavily by like the right wing narratives, and how like the legal system is like sometimes so inclusive in that I feel frustrated but feel like I'm fighting a side of a narrative more so like than utilizing something that's just meant for progress. So I definitely feel like often to your point of like, I used to do policy work, and to your point about some people being afraid to speak in those kind of spaces, it's very true. It's afraid to make those moves. Does anybody else have any response to how lawyers can leverage the law and the challenges to doing that?
I can chime in briefly. I don't know why you letting the transactional lawyer. I'm joking, but not really. A couple small contributions, I think. One is knowing the law well enough to challenge budgets that ultimately support criminalization and carceral institutions. And so in New York, when we were doing organizing stuff in summer 2020, and there was a big push around defund, you know, we had folks who had done different types of policy work and support around different movements, who knew the timeline budget, who kind of knew what were the sort of possible ways in which to disrupt that process, and the finalization process and so on and so forth, which kind of helped, I think, you know, for some of the organizing to figure out how to challenge those that process that was ultimately supporting the increase in funding to police in New York. And the second thing I'll mention is leveraging the laws, knowing it well enough to really lift up the contradictions that could be useful for political education purposes, and sort of helping to folks sort of build the base. So thinking about summer 2020 with like all this disparate enforcement of COVID-19 policies that we were seeing in different parts of the city, and kind of making connections between the ways in which COVID, these carceral systems like the cops and jail and capitalism are all sort of linked, and sort of the legal apparatus that kind of helps support that, which was helpful, I think, in some of the organizing work that we were doing.
I love that. It's like, I love like connecting with like the concepts of street law and how people can kind of be like, learn about what's wrong instead of, because I think sometimes when I do organizing, people have a difference, and lawyers can be that person that doesn't reinforce that, but also says, no, there's something wrong with this too. Like, I think that we have some power there. Does anybody else want to jump in to that question before I move on?
I'll just jump in real quick to say, I'm not a lawyer, but I work with a lot of lawyers and organize with and around lawyers. And I would say, I think the way that lawyers can be useful in the movement and in combating the criminalization of dissent is like being willing to throw down on whatever it is. So like 23 people were arrested on Sunday and charged with domestic terrorism and taken to the DeKalb County Jail, which is, an absolute hellhole that is incredibly violent. And we needed to quickly pull together a bunch of attorneys to represent people at their bond hearings, right? And try to get them out. We need attorneys for that. We need attorneys who are in it for the long haul. In 2020, a bunch of attorneys wanted to take cases pro bono, and we paired them up with folks. And then a year later, I heard from them saying, "I can't do this anymore. You have to find a new attorney." And so we also don't need attorneys who are just going to be in it when it's popular to be in it. We even need attorneys who are, as actions happen and, folks are putting out the narrative work around it. We need, attorneys who are willing to look at press releases and say like, hey, here, here's the legal liability, and, here's what you might not want to say. Here's what you, might want to say. So I think, we need attorneys who are in relationship with organizers on the ground and who can be ready to, plug in as needed, because, there are really specific skills that attorneys have that we don't. And so, just being ready to jump in those ways, I think is really important and useful.
Yeah. I invite you to respond, Alina, but I can also move on. So
no, I'm happy to jump in. I would just add that I think in a lot of these spaces, lawyers can really be engaged in kind of world making. I mean, in the immigrant rights space, based on, everything in the immigrant rights space is like bad Supreme Court precedent. Like, the courts and the law have always been on the side of folks who want to say that the US government can do anything it wants to immigrants and no one has the power to intervene. And because of that, First Amendment suppression and like really silencing immigrants is really baked into every aspect of our deportation and detention system. It's like really designed for people not to be able to speak out without being immediately whisked away, deported. And that's how it's always been. And immigrant communities know that. And the law, when it has been challenged, oftentimes we lose, right? So there was a bad Supreme Court case in the 90s that basically says that immigrants don't have the right to bring a selective enforcement claim. They can't say I was targeted because, I was speaking out on this issue, or this was, I was part of this group. And because of that, I think we can get really discouraged from then, speaking truth when we see it, that this is still retaliation. People are being silenced. This should be considered unconstitutional, even if our courts over and over again, like fail immigrant communities. And so I think we as a community, and for the law students who are watching, like not to be discouraged by bad court, like that's the norm, the bad court cases, the old precedent, people saying that this isn't a right that you can assert in court, not to allow that to stop us from trying to bring these claims, from jumping in when our people need folks to jump in. And I think that's what we saw, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was brought into this intersection of immigrant rights and the First Amendment because of a client who was very, like anybody could just watch what was happening unfold and see that he was being targeted because he was an activist, and ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, just didn't like what he was saying. And yes, we knew there was a bad Supreme Court case. We knew that there were all sorts of reasons why the courts would not be helpful in stopping this from happening. But we saw, litigation as one tool that could be used to support the movement, because it was on the streets, people protesting his arrest, folks being willing to put their bodies on the line and get arrested, people packing the courtroom. That made it very clear what was happening, even though the precedent wasn't there. And so law students, along with lawyers, community organizers, members of our clients' community, like they came together and realized that our work was not just putting together a good brief or trying to come up with a reason why a lower court should just ignore what the Supreme Court said or fit into this one exception. That was part of it, but it was also really engaging in the work of keeping our eyes on the movement narrative. So in addition to the litigation work, we put together teach-ins about what it means for immigrants to be exercising First Amendment rights. We worked with journalists and media. We did storytelling, and we really centered immigrant communities that for them, it was obvious that this was suppression and it had been happening a long time. And, in that case, we lost, then we won, then we lost, then we won, and we're still in this cycle. It's happening with all of my clients today who have spoken out and have faced retaliation. We can get victories from the court, but ultimately it really is about the way we interpret and translate this work into the public sphere, and how we, really use this to amplify the exact same voices that the system is trying to silence, so that they know that they're not going to get away with it. Even if the court rubber stamps what they're going to do, part of what we do with the law is to find spaces and create a new meaning for what it means for an immigrant to be exercising their First Amendment rights, what it means to view the system as a racist, classist system that has existed in order to silence and to extract power from our communities. So I think that that's part of it's one of the things in law school I know we often try and teach is that, like, you read these cases and it sounds awful, and it is awful, and that's the reality of our legal system. But we can reinvent it. We can try, and that's the language that we have to use to make sure that we both don't emphasize the court and litigation as being the main part of this, because it's clearly not, but that we also don't let them off the hook for what they say, and that this can be part of the way that we amplify the messages of our communities and what they're up against by using the systems in that way.
Thank you a lot. I really appreciate what you said, kind of bringing out this narrative about how we need, lawyers need to be a part of a broader theory of change for how to get things done, and not necessarily like, there's like a lot of mythology about how a lawyer comes in and saves the day. And I really appreciate like multiple people saying that and just kind of bringing that context in really quickly. Because I think it's really solid advice, especially as, when I was a new attorney, it was really important for me too. So I appreciate that. And we can move forward. And the next question, and I know some people touched on this a little bit, and when they responded, and it's how is legislation or criminal laws or other laws used today against protesters specifically? And you can reference any particular situation. Examples would be the momentum in 2020 and the pipeline protests, and even Cop City and other examples. But how is those kind of situations, what legislative or criminal law response, like have y'all seen that kind of codified or attempt to codify, temptation to codify. I'm sorry, y'all. Attempts to codify. It's like a long day of work today. All right, who wants to go? Anybody want to jump in?
I can kick us off. Yeah, I mean, so criminal law, I mean, for one, I'll say there's already so many laws on the books that, you know, as protesters, you know, gathered yesterday in downtown Atlanta, you know, there was this massive police presence, and then they were gathering as part of the week of action to stop Cop City. This is the 5th week of action across the last couple of years. And there was truly just a march. They stayed even on the sidewalk. And, you know, police were so ready to jump that they literally broke up this march to wait at crosswalks for the light to change because police were ready to arrest on jaywalking charges. So, you know, that's just to say that, you know, there's already so many laws on the books, you know, that they can use to criminalize, you know, protests in any way, and they're using them. You know, they detained multiple people yesterday for posting a banner on a highway, and you know the charge was going to be littering, and they ended up you know letting them go after many hours of questioning. But you know, but with that said, you know the Georgia legislature right now has you know multiple anti-protest bills that are pending, and of course you know the biggest one is the 2017 law that was passed codifying domestic terrorism as a state charge, and that is what 42 people, you know, have already been charged with here in Atlanta. 24 of them, I believe, are still sitting in jail, having been denied bond. There is rumor that there will be RICO charges introduced against folks in the movement. And so, you know, the repression is really just, you know, in full swing. Criminal law is, you know, the weapon that they're using. But I'll also say, I think something, you know, an important lesson that some of this is showing us is that charges don't have to stick, of course, for them to be, you know, a tool of oppression and, you know, to cause massive damage in people's lives. You know, without non-legal opinion, you know, it's very unlikely in my mind that these domestic terrorism charges will stick for many people, because many people aren't even alleged to have committed a felony, which is required under this law. But they know that they can keep people in jail for weeks or months or years and ruin people's lives just by throwing that charge at them. They know that they can scare a lot of people off and try to stop people from joining the movement by using these, you know, by using these charges. And so, you know, in the way that it's, you know, these laws are used, you know, to repress, it's both the specific charges and the way that they, you know, work to ruin people's lives and lock people up for years. And there are still people dealing with cases from 2020 and before where, you know, Atlanta police arrested hundreds and hundreds of people during the 2020 uprisings. But then it's also about, you know, the broader intimidation and chilling of speech and, you know, and expression that they use, you know, these arrests, even when they know that the charges aren't going to stick for.
Yeah, we in Alabama, we have a law right now that was just introduced about domestic terrorism, and it's very scary. So I definitely understand. Does anybody else have any response?
I wanted to just pick up on a couple of threads that Micah was mentioning. So just wanted to uplift that this use of the framing of terrorism to delegitimize social movements, like there's a long history of it, you know, in the context of Palestine, environmental racism, anti-Black racism, and so you know we see the domestic terrorism law in Georgia, which was actually passed after Dylan Roof and the mass shooting of a Black church, South Carolina, and then some of the sort of critical infrastructure laws that were passed after the 2016 through 2018 Dakota Access Pipeline protests, which also sort of cast kind of environmental justice movements as kind of criminal enterprises, or, you know, terrorist or whatever language that's used, not only to kind of criminalize, but just as part of a social effort to delegitimize these movements. And then the anti-terrorism laws, which are what we often see used against Palestine solidarity sort of activists. And then Micah, you also mentioned RICO, the Racketeering Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, or I never can remember the acronym, but just wanted to uplift that is also, again, like a legal tool that has historically been used against environmental justice advocates. So we at CCR were representing folks who were protesting against the Dakota Access Pipeline and were sued by Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the pipeline. And they were suing these organizers and activists under RICO, sort of saying that everyone was part of this criminal enterprise to discredit the pipeline. And we ultimately won, but as Micah said, you know, like these, even when you win at the end, which often you do, the threat of these types of lawsuits can be really, you know, devastating to movements. So.
Yeah, I've experienced a real fear when the Trump administration, it's probably like more administrative, determined what BIE was, like a Black identity extremist. And so I definitely resonate with just like what can elicit. Julian, did you get off mute? Did you get off?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that. No, I was just gonna add, just thinking about some stuff that was happening in New York during summer 2020, and just the ways in which you have the intertwining of sort of property law and criminal law, and sort of the protection of property as a ways in which the NYPD had certain authority to displace folks, right? So there was about, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks prior to the New York City Council passing the budget that year, because they're on I think it's July 1st is when it starts. There were folks who were in the space outside of City Hall, camping out, doing art, doing political education, doing all sorts of engaging activities, and had like, there was a bookstore, there was food, so on and so forth. And eventually, I believe from what I recall, about a couple weeks after the budget had been passed, eventually the police displaced folks from that space under the auspices of it being, you know, the property of the city, and folks sort of loitering and so on and so forth. And so just the ways in which through that process folks were arrested and so on and so forth, and sort of property laws and means to exclude people can also lead to criminality as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in to also bring into the conversation the ways that like prison regulation, jail rules are used to suppress organizing on the inside as well. This is something that we've seen a lot in our work where, you know, in the name of protecting the security of the prison, they will prevent people speaking out about violence that has been perpetrated by guards, or about the horrible food or the lack of medical care. And it's like a microcosm for everything that's happening on the outside, using the criminal laws to bring people into this space. And then when folks are trying to speak out from that space, you know, just being subjected to solitary confinement, to being transferred. In the immigration space, we've worked with a number of people who've engaged in hunger strikes, who've written grievances, complaints, petitions, who've spoken to the press. And the next thing you know, they are fast-tracked for deportation or transferred, you know, to a detention facility across the country. And it is just such a commonplace part of how the system is structured. And we, one of the things that we've like really mapped through this is that the retaliation is very commonplace. And the language that GAR's correctional officers use is really this language about security, literally of having to stop rebellion and uprising within the jail. that, that people who refuse to go to the lunchroom until they can talk to a sergeant, that they're inciting a riot. That kind of language is something that can really be traced to so many different abolition movements, and is often the same kind of language that people use, to say, like, this protest is too violent or is too much at risk of violence, that we are not even going to allow this speech to happen. And I think it's that law and security framework for suppressing speech that makes people uncomfortable, and really kind of supporting a white supremacist framework in this country that you see kind of replicated at every stage. And I'll drop in a chat. There's in my professorial hat, recently wrote an article that is trying to compare the current movement to abolish immigration detention and the way free speech has been repressed in immigration detention, to the way you can see in the movement to abolish slavery, that the same kinds of tactics and the same justification for laws preventing people from speaking out, it's a pattern that really is used in very open ways in the carceral system. So I think that the organizing on the inside that we've tried to support with like outside organizing, the retaliation that people face is so severe, that it's had a great effect, particularly in my region in New York, and I think across, certainly in the South, in all of the Southern detention centers, many of which were, jails and prisons just a second ago, and got emptied and then got contracts for ICE. Like, that kind of profiteering and using suppression to keep those systems going is a really significant linkage across a lot of the work that I think we all do.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one more question before we kind of do individual questions. So I got a note that I should bring up the CLE. So in order to receive your CLE credit, the CLE code, and we can put in the chat too, is 8 capital PLATE. That's the code. Can somebody from you can put in the chat? Okay. Oh, we got it on picture. Okay. There's the CLE code. Okay. All right. So the last question before we ask individual questions is, how does the Stop Cop City and other recent movements reflect this moment we are now facing in reflection about crackdown and dissent? And what does this suggest about the future of movement organizing and how we should respond? I'll put that in the chat too.
I'm sorry to go first again, but it might make sense as someone who's doing some of the Stop Cop City organizing. Yeah, oh my gosh. I mean, there's so many connections. I think that there's so many lessons to be gained from, what we're seeing in the crackdown on the Stop Cop City movement, and also, the push to build Cop City in the first place. So, first on the crackdown and the repression and the counterinsurgency. Sorry, I realize I should talk slower for interpreters. Of course, like I said, domestic terrorism charges, alleged, rumored RICO charges, extreme violence, extreme force, the task force that has been working together is, Atlanta police, DeKalb County police, Georgia state troopers, GBI, the feds, there's everybody involved. And so, expecting, and, of course, this is not new, but expecting sort of this highly coordinated effort between, whether it's the Atlanta Democrats or the Georgia Republicans or the National Democrats, they're all working together and bringing the same charges. There's a, nominally progressive prosecutor in DeKalb County who is, prosecuting many of the domestic terrorism charges. So that's one broad. Two, I think one counterinsurgent tactic that we're seeing especially is, and of course this goes back to the civil rights movement and before also, is the use of outside agitator narratives. And that's sort of been the city's prevailing talking point in talking about these protests. On Sunday night, reports from on the ground suggested that 23 people were actually taken to jail, but 35 people were arrested at first and detained. And what reports from the ground suggested is that cops were taking people's IDs and letting people who are from Georgia or Atlanta go, and keeping folks who are from out of state. And so that's not confirmed in any sense, but the point being that they are really savvy about what narratives work for them in terms of being able to demonize these movements and paint them as all outside agitators. The one other quick thing I'll add, that is less about the backlash to the Stop Cop City movement and more about the front lash of Cop City, is that in the wake of these uprisings, and in the wake of any uprisings, I think Cop City, which is happening in Atlanta, there was a cop academy approved in Chicago that's under construction. There are plans for police militarization and military facilities in Hawaii and Michigan, the National Guard, and blanking Texas. But these facilities are cropping up everywhere, and it is part of the state really sort of cementing its weaponry for the next phase of climate disaster and really, capitalist control as the world warms and, people take to the streets. And so, I think that the Stop Cop City movement is showing, both what the front lash and the backlash is looking like in terms of, some of the state's techniques for both responding to movements and also, preparing for, climate disaster, preparing for what's to come.
Is there anything that you think we should do to respond? Just to make sure, if you wanted to answer that part. But you don't have to.
join the Stop Cop City movement. join movements wherever you are. Organize with people. That's so basic, but yeah.
Yeah. I got a little climate anxiety listening to that. I do climate change work. So.
Sorry, me too.
Okay. Does anybody else want to respond? This one.
Yeah, sure. I can go. So I think, one thing that I wanted to just, and Micah, you sort of said this, is I think the Stop Cop City movement has brought together movements who are sort of challenging environmental injustice and racism and displacement, and also those who are challenging the criminal legal system and, the carceral state more broadly. And it's not, of course, the first time that these movements have come together. And I think all of these issues are really cross-cutting, but I think this particular moment is a really fundamental and I think radical challenge to like a capitalist society that uses its resources to expand its criminal legal system instead of directing its resources towards institutions that would actually enhance public safety and well-being, like parks and forests and schools and healthcare, So I think just in terms of the movement itself, I think it's just so fundamental and an important kind of flashpoint. And then the only other point that I wanted to make on how the government is responding is sort of about how I think this moment reflects the dangers of the criminal legal system more broadly, or us as lawyers trying to use the criminal legal system to respond to oppression or racialized violence, right? So as I mentioned, the domestic terrorism law that most of the folks who are charged in the Stop Cop City protests was enacted after Dylan Roof's mass shooting at a Black church in South Carolina. And I think the law was a reaction to racialized violence. It was an attempt to respond to this horrific event. And it was an effort to sort of subvert the framework of terrorism to target sort of white supremacist violence. But I think once again, I mean, what was happening now, what is happening now shows us is that the criminal legal system and these legal tools are most often going to be used to oppress those that we support, our clients, our partners. And so I think one of the, maybe this is an answer to the question of like, how should we respond or what to take away from this? I think it's just aware, like I think as lawyers and as policymakers and whoever, we should be wary to try to use the criminal legal system to respond to these types of events. And I think we all kind of know and think about this, but once again, like this moment is a really clear example of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anybody else have any? Okay. Well, we'll move on. We can start with Julian, if he doesn't mind. What threats does the solidarity economy face from other institutions that need to be organized against? And how can building a strong solidarity economy empower communities to resist the fracturing that we see under the capitalist state?
I missed the, so that's a compound. Can you
It is. I'm gonna post it. But the gist of it is, what threats have you seen in that particular movement around activism, and just how can that work of building a solidarity economy resist these capitalist infrastructures?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. It's something I've been thinking about a little bit over the past year in terms of some of the scholarship that I'm thinking about engaging in. But the ways in which we were talking earlier about the ripple effects of folks being put in jail for charges that we know aren't going to stick end up having pretty significant impacts, even in the context of the work that I do. And so when we talk about folks who are looking to the solidarity economy, and what I mean by that is, for folks who aren't super aware of it, we're really talking about a framework and a movement that is offering sort of a challenge and an alternative to sort of our racial capitalist system that is rooted in equity, rooted in solidarity, rooted in cooperation, so on and so forth. And so a lot of that work ends up being worker cooperatives. And there's a way in which folks who have, let's say, a record in ways that they would want to do work, let's say as an entrepreneur or doing work in other contexts, like that stifles their ability to get funding, let's say if they want to get sort of a loan to start up their worker cooperative. And one of the issues that are really big in this space is financing, because you can't go to a venture capitalist or go to quote unquote capital markets and sell bonds and shares, right, to raise capital in the way that you would in a lot of other institutions, because we're really talking about empowering the workers so that they are the ones who control their destiny. They're the ones who benefit from the profits. And so there are ways in which that leads to issues. There's a lot of folks who come into the space unhealed from all sorts of trauma, whether it's from their interactions with the carceral system or their interactions in just traditional workspaces that operate with a lot of these carceral logics in terms of being exploited, being unable to voice your opinion, and the unlearning that has to happen even before you talk about a different structure. It takes time, and it's something that most lawyers aren't very well equipped to do. A lot of the partners that we work with sometimes aren't very cognizant of the need for that healing work to happen. And so those are some of the challenges. In terms of building solidarity economies and how that can help, I mean, I think we saw that within the context of COVID and sort of mutual aid efforts that were happening that were rooted very much so on solidarity. But also the ways in which solidarity requires us to think beyond what we have in ways that are really talking about how do we build these alternatives, right? If we're talking about making communities safe and having those conversations with folks in the community who are very much so like, I feel like I can only be safe with a cop on the block. The work that we do is really about helping people sort of imagine, but also start to sort of build the infrastructure that creates some of the resources that can help folks avoid being engaged in whatever the state says is criminal these days in the first place, and allows folks to sort of build the relationships that are prerequisite to building solidarity economy institutions that can help folks then look out more for each other, then sort of think about things such as sort of different alternative approaches to conflict, so on and so forth. And so it's a gateway, I would say, to some of the build work that I like to think about is important as an accompaniment to some of the fight work. And it's something that was, I think, within the context of sort of the Black liberation struggle, a lot of civil human rights leaders that we often look to, a lot of them have connections to cooperative economics as sort of a ways in which we think about the alternative, with the recognition of the ties between capitalism, policing, and capitalism, and the ways in which, you know, the class contradictions that I think are coming up a lot in Cop City and other places, right, where you have folks who look like us, quote unquote, supporting these sorts of initiatives. It really forces us to kind of wrestle with those issues as well.
I definitely see a connection between Astha's comment about kind of us not playing into these like reactionary acts for these legal policies and things like that, and then kind of like this, like, what is next, what do we want instead, and how to build that. And you made me think on a personal note about a time my grandfather grew up in segregation in Alabama, and he talked about how one day he told me, like, I've never seen a Black cop when I was growing up, like how he just never really, the concept of like what we see today wasn't something that he experienced, and how like people were extremely mistrusting to a really large level of police, especially because of how their connection to the Klan and things like that, and how we have had that vision before. We've had these kind of structures before, and we just gotta reclaim it in a way, even though that was kind of imposed in a lot of ways. It's something that we recognize. We just have to trust it in ourselves. And I will go to Astha. And the question is, how do corporations and the state collaborate to target activists? What concrete examples can you share? And especially if it's a collaboration between, for example, like the oil companies and the state institutions to suppress land protectors, for example, like how have you seen corporations be kind of like this partner with the state?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's, you know, a variety of ways in which corporations or private actors more generally in the state collaborate to target activists. And, you know, I think they use each other's tools. So I wanted to just speak about one really concrete example, which is the set of laws in the environmental justice context around critical infrastructure that, again, are relevant to the Stop Cop City protests too, because the domestic terrorism law there has a critical infrastructure component to it. So in 2016, 2018, when the Dakota Access Pipeline protests were happening, the protests at Standing Rock, there were similar protests happening, of course, across the country, including in Louisiana against the Bayou Bridge Pipeline, which is actually, the Bayou Bridge Pipeline is at the southern end of the same network of pipelines that the Dakota Access Pipeline is a part of. And in reaction to these protests, Oklahoma was the first state to pass a critical infrastructure law, which imposed really heavy penalties for, like, the law was very vague, but interfering with critical infrastructure. And then based on the Oklahoma critical infrastructure law, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, created model legislation that was then introduced and passed in a number of states. So for those of, I mean, most people probably know, but ALEC is a group of corporations, right-wing actors, and conservative legislators that come together to draft model legislation that gets introduced into state legislative bodies. And they're behind the critical infrastructure laws. They've been tied to the anti-BDS laws. So the laws which prohibit government contracts with organizations that support the Palestinian call for a boycott of Israel until it follows international law and ends the occupation. So anyway, so ALEC created this model legislation based on the Oklahoma law. And then based on that sort of model, Louisiana Mid-Continental Oil and Gas Association, so an association of sort of oil and gas interests, introduced the critical infrastructure law in Louisiana, which was passed in 2018. And then just a couple weeks after it was passed, it was used to arrest folks protesting against the Bayou Bridge pipeline. And it made it a felony, I think, punishable with like 5 years in prison to trespass upon a pipeline, which in Louisiana is basically the entire state because there's pipelines everywhere. So CCR is challenging this law, but it was something that was created really directly with oil and gas. And then you see like a really clean line to then the state using it to target activists. And so I think that's just what, I mean, when you start talking about ALEC, there's like so many examples that you could talk about corporate and sort of state collaboration and co-optation. But I think that the critical infrastructure laws are a really good example of that.
Thank you. Alina, and you've touched on this a bit, but I invite you to get kind of specific because I think it's a really important conversation. And the question is, how has immigration itself been criminalized in the US? And how has this impacted migrants' ability to protest injustice? And more specifically, how can lawyers help empower immigrants to protest and organize despite those conditions?
No, thank you. So I think, as I was saying earlier, the immigration system as a whole is designed to really suppress the rights of immigrants. And there's plenty of law on the books that would make you believe that essentially the US government can do whatever it wants. And that makes speaking out incredibly difficult. Just to give a recent example, I mean, so our clinic, starting with the client that I had mentioned earlier, Rabab, who was a leader in the sanctuary movement in New York City, and Jean Montreville, who also was a leader in the sanctuary movement, that they were both targeted the same day by the same ICE office for deportation. And again, to everyone, it was obvious, like you're targeting two leaders of the sanctuary movement at a time where ICE was supervising thousands of people in our region. And you're going to have us believe that this is just, ordinary business as usual enforcement of immigration law. The community fought back against that. And I think that, like, showing up, speaking out, being at the rallies, being at the protests, being present was incredibly powerful, because the more bodies on the street, the more clear it was that, business as usual itself is a horrible, horrific thing. But we certainly weren't going to buy that this wasn't being used to target people. And so I think that reaction was incredibly important. I think as part of what I was mentioning before, that, our work was not only to defend the rights of individual immigrants, but really to convince the people that this was a thing, that the silencing was a thing, and that the First Amendment should be stepping in to protect the rights of immigrant activists. In addition to the teach-ins and to some of the, the writing, the media work, we tried to document these cases. And so the NYU Immigrant Rights Clinic students created a map really showing like more than 1,000 instances of retaliation that had been popping up in the media, in stories, in lawsuits against immigrant activists, including clearly people who are non-citizens and therefore subject to the most oppressive deportation power, but also citizens who spoke out. We saw the criminal prosecutions of folks with No More Deaths who were providing humanitarian aid to people who are crossing the US-Mexico border and were dying in the desert. That was a criminal prosecution that occurred that targeted U.S. citizens who were trying to be helpful and to bear witness and to provide humanitarian aid work. And we saw widespread surveillance of rallies in our region, New York. The New York field office was tracking all of the protests that were happening around immigrant rights issues, white supremacism, all of these things. But the title of their Excel spreadsheet was anti-Trump rallies, which we just thought was like mind-boggling that they named all of being opposed to white supremacists means that you're an anti-Trump person. And so it's just very clear to us how significant the surveillance state and the Department of Homeland Security had become within immigrant spaces, but like a cascading kind of harm. So documenting that is incredibly important, but it's also equally important to know that it didn't change when the Trump administration changed to the Biden administration. I represent a woman named Miss Q, who right now is sitting in a jail in Orange County, New York, facing deportation and is being detained. And she had previously been in immigration detention in 2021 under the Biden administration when ICE was transferring her and transferred her in like 5-point shackles, walked her across a grate, her shackles got caught, and the ICE officer, either because he didn't believe her or didn't care when she said they were caught, violently tugged on her, causing her to fall on her face, cut her head open, and broke her ankle. And she filed a Federal Tort Claims Act claim against ICE, right? She spoke out, she filed a civil rights claim on behalf of the women she was detained with because she wasn't getting medical care for her broken ankle. And she found out other women were also not getting care for their medical conditions in jail. So she spoke out, the community rallied, got her release, and then she continued to speak out and she pursued the FTCA claim and she spoke to the media and she started testifying on behalf of a bill we have in New York called the Dignity Not Detention Act. And lo and behold, at her next ICE check-in, even though they had released her and nothing else had changed other than the fact that she kept speaking out and testifying to legislators, they detained her again. And so, you know, she's still in that jail. We ran into court and we brought a First Amendment claim and a number of other claims to stop her deportation. The judge issued something called a stay of deportation, kind of preventing ICE from acting. And now we're trying to get her out, trying to make the case that this is retaliation. And the government's official response under the Biden administration, ICE is represented by the Department of Justice when we bring these cases in federal court. The Department of Justice's position remains that no federal court has the power to even consider whether her First Amendment rights have been violated. And so, you know, the administration's changed, like, you know, the face of policy changes, you know, whether it, you know, we have friends in our community who are in the administration, but the immigration laws themselves and the legal position of this kind of intense power over immigrant lives doesn't change. And that is why, you know, our calls for abolishing the system are really the only reasonable ones, because that is truly what will allow our people to be free and to be able to speak out. And I'll drop a link in the chat for folks who want to support Ms. Q. Our organizers are raising funds for people inside who've been organizing for dignity, not detention. So I'll drop that in the chat now. But that's really what we're up against. But I do want to say I feel like we are making progress because people they've been seeing this and they have not been afraid to speak out. They've been still speaking out because it's the only thing that they can do to fight back against the system.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So, sometimes I do like a lot of work around trauma, and I just really empathize with I used to do some deportation work, and I empathize a lot with like what you can feel from those situations. So, Micah, and you've been doing amazing work with the Cop City. I don't want to call it a situation, but the Cop City, yeah. So, and just to like ground us in that right now before we kind of do our closing. And I know earlier you talked a lot about like just some of the things you felt were kind of presenting challenges to lawyering in this moment. And also some of the things that were happening with policing there. But I invite you to expound a little bit so we can kind of connect with like anything that we can do or we can think through. But the question is, what are you seeing on the ground, and how have the police and the city, by extension, worked to terrorize protesters and suppress dissent against the Cop City movement, the Stop Cop City movement? How are organizers fighting back, and what are ways that lawyers and organizers can collaborate effectively in these moments?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so just which I should have done at the beginning, but just really quickly, in case folks don't know what Cop City is. Cop City is a proposal in the city of Atlanta to destroy between 85 and 381 acres of precious forest land that is in a majority Black community. This land has 2 prisons that surround it. It has one of the 10 most polluted rivers that runs through it. It's already both a very disinvested area and also an area that is really crucial green space. It's been referred to as one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. And so it's a proposal to destroy this forest land and to create a $90 million police training, police militarization facility in its place. And so folks have been, fighting this proposal for years since it went public in 2021. And, the repression has continually increased. On the day of the final city council vote where they approved the facility, there were 17 hours of public comment of community members saying, we do not want this facility, do not build it. And we do want forest land, and we actually need forest land because we're in the midst of climate disaster, and Atlanta has already lost an enormous amount of its tree canopy, and to lose more will be devastating, and it'll be devastating for everyone across the country, but particularly for the communities surrounding this area. And on top of all of this is of course stolen indigenous land. This is Muskogee land, and Muskogee folks have now gotten involved in the movement actually, and it's been really beautiful to see. So in terms of what we're seeing on the ground, I've talked a little bit about the repression and some of the narratives that the state is using to try to repress and control this movement. I actually thought maybe I'll talk about some of the beautiful things that are happening and some of the beautiful ways that people are resisting. So maybe if you've seen coverage, you've probably seen coverage of some of the radical direct actions where equipment has gone up in flames, or there have been various events with sort of direct action tactics on construction equipment and facilities related to the forest. And that's one part of this really autonomous broad movement. Other parts of this movement include the preschoolers who have marched multiple times, holding signs that say, "I love you, trees, don't cut down the trees." These kids marching in the streets, taking the streets, saying, we don't want this thing built. It includes clergy who showed up to city council, just this past Monday and preached and, spoke on a moral and spiritual level about why this land is sacred and cannot be destroyed. It includes the Muskogee folks who were displaced on the during the Trail of Tears from this land, who are coming back and today served an eviction notice to Mayor Andre Dickens saying, "Hey, this is our land, this is not your land." Wow, sorry, getting emotional. So anyway, all of that to say, this is embarrassing. It is this beautiful movement of so many people who are speaking out and saying, do not destroy this land, do not build Cop City. on Sunday night, when police were rounding people up and arresting people, there were folks at a festival that was about a mile away from where this action occurred, and police. There were children in this group of about 100 people who were being threatened with arrest and threatened with domestic terrorism charges by the police. And this group, I'm going to cry again, this group banded together and linked arms and said, you know, we're not leaving unless we can all leave together. And they sent people to negotiate with the police, and they were eventually allowed to release, to leave. And so, you know, the solidarity that's being expressed, and the support that has flown in from all over has been really incredible. And I think that that's just as worth uplifting, as some of the horrible tactics of repression. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I know that was like a little emotional for everybody. A lot of the things that people said were really, it's really obvious that a lot of us are doing this work because of the love we have for people and each other. So, this actually is a really good transition to just kind of like an opportunity for everyone to kind of just give last thoughts. We're about 7 minutes before it's time to go, but and we can just popcorn it. And so it's given the acceleration of state and corporate suppression that we're seeing. What are your predictions for the future of liberation and justice movements? And what do we need to start doing now within these movements to protect each other while pushing back? Which is why that was a good segue. If anybody has any thoughts.
I'll just add that I know how important it is for us to show up for each other, for all of the ways that we've been intersectionally affected by this. And I want to uplift a resource that my colleague Jessica Raffay worked on with Make the Road and a number of folks here in New York to support folks who wanted to come out on the protests during the uprisings and rebellion of 2020, who are immigrants, to know their rights and to know how they could participate in those protests and feel safe. And I feel like those kinds of resources that really help us show up and show up for each other are really important. So I'll also try to find that and put it in the chat as well.
Anyone else, just feel free.
Yeah, I guess I can give a few last thoughts. I mean, I think a lot about corporate power and monopolies and all that kind of stuff in my work, and I think continue to name these actors and the role that they're playing in the context of the continued suppression that we're seeing, the continued displacement, right? The other types of violence that folks are experiencing, the other types of suffering that they're exporting kind of every day. And so I think continuing to name the folks who are complicit, and I think at the same time continuing to sort of really stretch ourselves to just build new relationships. Like I was talking to someone earlier today. I was like, people, it's like you go to work, if you're religious, you go to church, and it's like we have to be like, and I do something for community. Like that has to be like the next thing. That's just like I brush my teeth. Right? It's just a thing that we kind of are doing every day and building these new relationships that both name and understand the interdependence that is core to sort of kind of who we are, but also is going to be core to building a world that's going to be different, and finding small ways to move in solidarity, whether it's doing time banking or engaging in stuff connected to mutual aid, or doing stuff connected to sliding, just there so many different ways. And I'll share in the link. I'll share a link to a really great visual for the solidarity economy. But we have to build a bigger we, and part of that is rooted in we need to kind of continue to lift up the connections and the contradictions that are rooted in the oppression that a lot of us are experiencing, but also yeah, building new relationships, to ourselves, building new relationships to the land. And a lot of it's building new, but also a lot of it's reclaiming the old. And so I think those are some things I'll leave folks with.
As I'm listening to you all, I'm just thinking about, like everything that the three of you just said makes me think about why it's so wonderful to be thinking about connection and relationship and like joy and beauty. And everything you described, Micah, is sort of grounded in joy and beauty, right? And I think part of why it's so great to end this panel in that way is because these are the types of things that, at least for me, make me feel powerful and make me feel like the movements that I'm a part of are powerful. And I guess, like, what is it that enables and restricts dissent and organizing? Like, some of it is legal protection, sure, like the First Amendment is important, but most of it, I think, is power and resources. Like, if you have the money and the resources and the power to change the law, or like to file a million lawsuits to try to silence folks, like that is a form of suppression that the First Amendment, like in some ways, can help you with, but not really. And so what really enables movement and organizing is power. And so I think it's just important to think about in our work, like, how are we redistributing power and resources? And there's many ways to do that. And I just love that the way that we're ending is by talking about how like relationships and joy really is part of that as well.
Okay, we got 1 minute. You got anything, Michael, a hashtag or a phrase? You good? Okay.
Yeah, hashtag Stop Cop City.
Okay. Yeah.
And cry on panels when you need to, I guess.
Okay. Thank y'all so much. I really learned so much from all of you. Y'all probably get a LinkedIn invite from me or something. And so thank y'all so much. This was really enlightening, and I feel very connected to a lot of the things y'all said. And just thank you for all of your thoughts and all of your encouragement for everybody who's watching. But I'll pass to Haley.
Thank you all so much to this panel for kicking off the second day of the Colloquium with such a powerful and important conversation, building on yesterday's historical background and bringing us into the contemporary moment, and really emphasizing the importance of solidarity. We are going to break for 30 minutes, but we will see you all back at 6:30 p.m. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, everyone. We will now turn to our fourth panel of the Colloquium, but our second of tonight, which is Resisting and Surviving, where we will discuss how criminalization of dissent impacts the lives of organizers in the wake of a justice uprising, and how it impacts organizers working under the threat of criminalization or punishment, and what resources and practices exist to support those who have been targeted because of their justice work. We will also hear from lawyers about the legal avenues and litigation tactics to resist these attacks. And remember, if you are an attorney seeking continuing legal education credit for this event, you must have registered with us in advance and must write down any CLE codes that the moderator announces and displays during the panel. This panel is moderated by Omavi Shukur. Omavi Shukur is a research scholar at Columbia Law and an adjunct professor here at NYU Law, where he teaches critical race theory. Omavi conducts research at the intersection of criminal law and criminal procedure, critical race theory, and critical legal studies. He also represents plaintiffs in civil rights cases and supervises law students who support abolitionist organizing. Omavi is currently the director of the Little Rock Freedom Fund. He has previously worked at the Orleans Public Defender, Levy & Levy, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Omavi received his JD from Harvard Law School, and you can read his full bio in the program. We will turn it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation. Today, we'll be discussing the means by which the state criminalizes resistance and how advocates work alongside communities to quell attempts at such criminalization. But in the tradition of abolitionism, we will also envision how the state should respond to dissent and how we can work together to transform the means by which the state responds to resistance as we work towards this abolitionist horizon. And I am excited to be in conversation with a great group of folks as we explore these issues. And so I will sort of introduce everybody right quick, and then we will jump into our conversation. So first we have Gideon Oliver. Gideon is a New York City-based solo attorney with a general practice focus on police misconduct litigation and criminal defense, as well as freedom of information law, advice, and litigation. He is a past president and longstanding member of the National Lawyers Guild, the NYC chapter, and a member of the Guild's National Police Accountability Project. In criminal cases and civil litigation, Gideon has represented thousands of protesters arrested around the RNC in 2004, critical mass bike rides, Occupy Wall Street, and the like. Next, we have, forgive me if I butcher your name, Joela Abione-Rivera. Did I get that right? Joela will...
Rivera.
Great.
You got it.
Great. Joela is the founder of the Stonewall Protest, a collective of organizers who center Black trans liberation by working towards the expansion of mutual aid, abolitionist teaching, and anarchy. She is also a social media educator, creating posts that spread the truths we were not taught. Joela's passion for abolition is not only rooted in the experiences she had being born and raised in the Bronx, but by the wisdom she received being raised by her Puerto Rican and Trini parents. She began her revolutionary work in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the rebirth of the Black Lives Matter movement, with her central message being abolition is liberation. And our panelists are so distinguished that I'm going to, just read part of their biographies, but they'll tell you about other parts as we go. Next, we have Ann White Hat. Ann is a member of the Ashke Teospaye. Is that right?
Ashke Teospaye, thank you.
Ashke Teospaye of the Sakangu Lakota Ayote. Is that right?
The Changu Lakota Oyate, that's our tribe, our nation.
Yes.
Thank
you. This nation is of the seven council fires of the Lakota Nation. Ann's father is a direct descendant of Chief Ironshell, and her grandfather was Chief Hollow Horn Bear. Her traditional homelands encompass the Black Hills and prairies of the upper Midwest, known as South Dakota, and has resided in Louisiana since 2010. Ann is one of the Indigenous women central to the leadership of the campaign to stop construction of the Bayou Bridge oil pipeline across 162 miles of Louisiana, and was arrested in September 18th, 2018, after leading a prayer ceremony at a boat launch near St. Martinville, Louisiana. And she was charged with 2 felony counts, and had been present on the property in question as a water protector with the permission of co-owners of the land. She engaged in nonviolent protests against the monitoring of the pipeline project and she engaged in nonviolent protests against and monitoring of the pipeline project, and was trying to raise awareness about the fact that the pipeline was being constructed on the property illegally, a fact later confirmed as the company was found by a Louisiana court in 2018 to have been trespassing at the time. And last but not least, we have Rabab Abdulhadi. Is that right? I don't want to. Okay, I'm assuming it's right. The founding director, senior scholar of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas studies program at San Francisco State University. He is the co-founding editorial board member of Islamophobia Studies Journal, lead editor of a book of volumes and author of over 80 articles and book chapters in 7 languages. She received her PhD from Yale University in scholarly awards and community honors, including the Sterling Fellowship, New York Century Scholarship, Best Nonfiction Book Award, and American Association of University Professors, National Women's Studies Association. She is compiling critical oral histories of Palestinian activism and editing an anthology on teaching Palestine and roundtables on Black liberation, abolition, and reparations, and whose narrative, gender justice, and Palestine. And I will tell you all that I just finished teaching my critical race seminar. So if I'm not the crispest, blame it on me just being a warm-blooded human being. So we will dive right into our conversation. And I would like to begin, since I know that none of you come to this conversation alone. You bring the communities you serve with you. And so if you will, please describe the communities you serve, what they are resisting against, and what they are agitating for. And later we'll describe your work with these communities, but first we'd like to center these communities. So again, describe the communities you serve, what they are resisting against, and what they are agitating for, just to anchor us. And we'll start in the order, we'll just go in the order of the introductions. And so if you will start us off, Gideon.
Sure, thank you. I think the communities that I represent are resisting against the government and agitating for justice and freedom.
Thank you. And if you could also describe the communities as well.
Sure, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm mostly thinking of clients. And for me, that's mostly people who are arrested and prosecuted by the government, and people who are engaged in civil litigation against the government.
Great. And next we'll go to Joela, Abione. Please describe the communities that you serve, what they are resisting against, and what they're agitating for. Welcome.
I think Black trans liberation, when you're fighting for Black trans liberation, you're subconsciously representing and serving all communities, because my belief is when Black trans women are liberated, we will all know liberation. What we are fighting against is the gender binary, the construct of gender, and fear. People's fear of change, people's fear of the truth, people's fear of knowledge. And I'm sorry, what was the last part?
I think, just describing, I think you described the community, but so I think you covered all the bases, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
If you want to explain a little bit more about sort of who the people you're serving are.
Oh, Black trans women.
Right.
Black trans women, Black trans people, Black queer people.
Next, we have Anne. And if you will describe the communities you're fighting, or you serve, the communities you serve, what they're fighting against, what are they resisting, and what are they agitating for?
Thank you so much for having me here to share our story. The communities, I would say the community that I'm working with are pretty much here in South Louisiana right now, and pretty much anybody who drinks water and wants access to clean water. Anybody in our communities that are fighting against oil and gas infrastructure here in South Louisiana. And particularly because we're in South Louisiana in the heart of oil and gas country, there are many pipeline projects, but we focused on a Bayou Bridge pipeline as the tail end of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and particularly the company run by Kelsey Warren Energy Transfer Partners, and we focused in on and zeroed in on them because of what they did to our relatives in South Dakota or North Dakota, and what they intended to bring down here to South Louisiana. So in this moment with White Hat versus Landry, you know, we're also focusing our efforts on challenging the amendments to the state's critical infrastructure law. So I think, does that answer?
Yes. Thank you for that. And in a bit, we'd love to hear more about the way that you are fighting alongside those communities to fight against that encroachment. But first, if you will, and please tell me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Rabab.
No, that's fine.
All right, Rabab, please tell us who's the community you serve, what are they against, and what are they fighting for?
Okay, so I'm gonna do it in two ways. One is that I'm born and raised in Nablus, Palestine. So I'm actually very much involved in the struggle for Palestinian freedom, justice, and resistance. But secondly, I'm a very firm believer in the indivisibility of justice. And I have historically and continue to struggle for various people who are also struggling for freedom and justice, whether we're talking about today's people who are fighting against Cop City, people who are fighting for abolition, for land rights, for water rights, for indigenous recognition, against white supremacy, racism. This has been my life history, both as an organizer, community organizer, and also since I joined the academy, also as the director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at San Francisco State University, which we take our inspiration from what we say the spirit of '68, the strike of the students by Black Student Union and Third World Liberation Front that demanded the decolonizing of the curriculum, the opening of the university to the community, refusing the borders that the university establishes, and accountability for any kind of academic and scholarly work. So one of the things that I'm very much involved in right now is to basically fight against criminalizing of Palestinian education, teaching Palestine, and against the Zionist, racist, neo-McCarthyism, attempts to silence us, which I would say probably intersects a lot with the attempts to fight for critical race theory that has also been targeted under a new wave of neo-McCarthyism.
Thank you for that. And I love this idea about the indivisibility of justice, right? And this touches on what Joela was talking about as well, Joela's school of thought is that by centering Black trans lives, it's a means to liberate us all. And so during our conversation, we're bringing all these communities here with us, right? So even though we see 4 brilliant people before us, all of these communities are present in the room with us. Now, I would like to shift slightly and talk about your service to these communities, specifically in grappling with the means by which the state responds to much of their resistance and their dissent. And so that response being criminalization in a lot of instances. And so if you will, may you sort of paint a picture for us? Can you describe how the state has criminalized the dissent of the communities you serve, and also describe the impact, right, that this criminalization has had that you've seen, right? So describe the means by which the state criminalizes this dissent, the impact it's had on the communities you served, and the strategies you have employed to protect said communities from the ravages of this criminalization. So it's a three-part question, and we will go in reverse order. And so we'll start with Rabab.
Okay. So one of the things that, well, the state, when we talk about the state in capital letters, I would say I'm talking about three different states. The state of Israel, that's basically trying to erase any presence of Palestinians and its apologists in the US. And I don't think we have the time to actually talk about what's going on, but only in the last week, we saw the massacre in Nablus, in my hometown, and I actually recognized almost every nook and cranny that they were talking about. So it's been quite devastating. And we saw the rampage in Hawara, which some people have likened to Kristallnacht or pogroms in the nearby city. So this is the state of Israel that's actually, as a settler colonial project, is trying to erase anything called Palestine. And its apologists in the US, the Israel lobby industry, which has failed to basically cover up, because Israel is unable to actually apologize or cover up what's going on. Its apologists in the US are basically trying to crush and censor and criminalize anybody who speaks up for Palestine, speaks up for justice for Palestine, whether you're Palestinian or not. You don't really have to be a Palestinian, just like we see with all the struggles. You don't really have to be a Black person to struggle against anti-Blackness. You don't have to be a prisoner to demand abolition. I mean, it's a question of justice. It is a question of the indivisibility of justice. The second state is the US state. The US state, United States, also has the same roots of settler colonial project that has also built itself on settler colonialism, on taking over and trying to genocide the indigenous people and kidnap people and imprison and enslave them here from Africa, exclusion and so on and so forth. There's a lot of history. I think people talked about that in the first day, and we can talk about this as well. And for us in particular, there has been not an addition, I would say exceptional or an additional, but a specific kind of criminalization of censorship, of surveillance. And I would just say, even from my own experience, I was returning in May from the World Social Forum conference in Mexico City, and I was stopped in Texas on my way to California to give a talk, and I was held, detained, and interrogated for 3 hours by 6 agents who would not really identify themselves until we finally finished, for 3 hours. And they kept saying, you're free to go. And I said, well, if I'm free to go, I would like to go. And then they said, no, you're not free to go. And it turns out to be Department of Homeland Security. There were other people that they would not identify themselves. They went through my papers. They asked me a lot of questions that they're not supposed to be asking me. And I've already protested to civil liberties groups and so on. Until now, we do not know why it happened, how it happened, except that it is an intimidation process in order for us to kind of like shut up, basically not be able to speak what we say, in addition to the fact that the US is the largest material supporter of the state of Israel and enabling it in everything. The last part of the state, I would say the state of California, and I teach at a public university, and the university is part of the state of California that has actually been colluding with the Zionist groups, and we can talk about that some more, with the Zionist groups to basically crush the Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies program, Ahmed Studies from now on, crush us, dismantle us in order for it to satisfy its alliances with the Israel lobby groups and with the right-wingers, with the white supremacists, with Islamophobes, with other people who would really like to stop the legacy of 1968 and basically make us teach something very fluffy, not really engage in the critical things that really students need to learn and we need to teach about. So all of this stuff has been, and this is part of also the corporatization of our public universities. I mean, this is a public university that's actually not even accountable to the public because they do a lot of things in secret behind our backs and through corporations and through the university corporation and so on. So some of the things that I would just like mention, some of the examples, smearing, tarnishing our reputation, accusing us of anti-Semitism, accusing of material support for terrorism, death threats. I've received several death threats, including voicemail. On my voicemail, I've received an email from somebody saying I should be killed. I had a Nazi student in my class who was threatening to all my students of color, indigenous students, and so on. And the university brought him in and actually counseled him. He had 250 posts against all our communities. I've had multiple Zionist groups who've had targeted me with misuse of university funds, who sued me. The Lawfare Project sued me and the university for 18 months. I have been audited for so many times, for every single time. I've been audited for 5 years, for example, for my financial, for my travel. And the only questions were, why am I collaborating with Palestinian universities? Why do I go to Palestine? There's nothing about all of these questions about missing money or missing cents or receipts or whatever. It's been again and again, and I've been a subject of the Canary Mission, one of the shadowish organizations, various Zionist groups, well-known like David Horowitz, Daniel Pipes, Judea Pearl, Anti-Defamation League, and so on, have been trashing me left and right again and again. And every single time, actually, there was an investigation we won. Every single investigation, clearly sweep. We defeated them in the lawsuit. We filed grievances last year, my colleague and I, because we were silenced in big classroom we had and so on. We won 100% decisively. Our faculty colleagues unanimously voted on our behalf, and they're still continuing to escalate that. And the only thing that I would say for now, just like the general topic, so I will stop. So, my colleagues will have a lot of things to also engage with this and speak, is that the only thing we say, we're not going to be silent. We're going to continue to speak up. It's our responsibility to continue to speak truth to power. As an educator, it is my job to teach about Palestine and about the indivisibility of justice. This is what I was hired to do anyway. I mean, they hired me to do that. They hired me to start the program, and then basically they reneged on it, switch and bait, and then they moved on. And I'm not going to stop doing it, what I'm doing, as we all are. We have to continue struggling. And I can talk about some of the stuff later on.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It kind of encourages compels me to shift away from the language of criminalization to this more capacious language of persecution, because what you're talking about is persecution even beyond criminalization by the state at these various levels. And so as we shift to N, I'll repeat the question, which is would you describe how the state has criminalized the dissent of the communities you serve, or persecuted dissenters in the community you serve? And what is that impact? What impact has that persecution had on these communities? And importantly, if you will, talk about some of the strategies, the most promising strategies that you've been a part of in combating that persecution and the effects of that persecution.
Sure, thank you very much. So I'll begin with just setting the stage here for so you can imagine our resistance movement to the Bayou Bridge pipeline down here. First of all, I just wanted to pay respects to the indigenous folks who here in the bayous of South Louisiana who have resisted the contamination of their Atchafalaya Basin and the waterways for many generations. So this is nothing new to us as Indigenous people to resist this. And one of my mentors remembers when she was 7 years old and her father, they're Choctaws, and he was out there standing against Dow Chemicals for dumping their chemicals into the Atchafalaya Basin. And this was like, 40, 50 years ago. So this is nothing new, and I wanted to make sure that this is recognized. Our campaign against about the Bayou Bridge pipeline was the first and really largest of its kind in terms of the nonviolent direct actions that we did to actually stop the pipeline construction. So, once we decided to pursue actually stopping construction, we were able to hold off completion of the pipeline for about 2 years, which is a significant amount of time for our small encampment. We did this through grassroots organizing across the pipeline itself as it ran across the state of Louisiana. So we educated folks all along the way, and we had a lot of really creative actions out there. But the violence against us continued to escalate as we were more and more effective at stopping the pipeline. So I would say that the state allowed pipeline construction workers and police officers moonlighting as security guards for the pipeline to brutalize water protectors on the line. They went unchallenged in that, and many times that were unreported. So there was a brutalization that happened a lot. Some of our members were brutally attacked, beaten. We were threatened with guns many times. We had things like this. We're out in way out in the swamp, where some of our actions, we would have to take about a half an hour, 45 minutes to get to the boat ramp. And then you jump on a boat and you go about another 30 minutes out to monitor pipeline construction. And sometimes in the case where I was arrested, we actually did that same routine, and then we hiked in for like another mile or so. So we're very remote, where where there was no witnesses. And so we relied on our media that was present, our journalists, who were also subject to the same brutalization out there in the Atchafalaya, and were able to document these assaults against us. Without them, we wouldn't really have anything to stand on right now, for their sacrifice and willingness and bravery to be out there with us. So because we were so effective in stopping construction, and I was actually on the very first lockdown of construction equipment, which we said we were going to do once they tried to push the pipeline underground and into the actual Atchafalaya Basin. And so we did. We said what we were going to do, and we did. And they were really shocked down here. And I remember the police and the sheriff's department saying things like they weren't going to have another Standing Rock down here. And so, it started like that. And the sheriff's department actually held a conference down here, and they invited, it was a national conference, and they invited sheriff's departments from up in Standing Rock to come and share their experience with the Louisiana folks about how they sort of handled the things up there. So we know they were collaborating. And so what ensued next, because we were so effective, was a form of lawfare, which is basically, we know, using the using our legislative process to criminalize us, in partnership with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. So they worked together to pass that law to criminalize our work, which was formerly misdemeanors. So we would do actions on the easement, the pipeline easement, which is a 75-foot wide, basically clear-cut pathway, and they lay the pipeline down in the middle of it, you know, and they kill everything on the land. So yeah, those used to be misdemeanors. And they passed a law and pushed them up to felony charges. So many of us were facing 5 to 10 years in prison. So that's sort of the lay of the land, okay? And the impact that had on us was we were under the threat of imprisonment for 4 years for the statute of limitations, before the statute of limitations expired for them to press formal charges. After 3 years, they said they were going to drop the charges, but we couldn't believe them. They always changed their mind. And so it did quell our movement. It did stop what we were doing. It allowed them to finish construction of the pipeline. And it placed an undue stress on us as mothers, you know. Several of us have children. And so, you know, I never intended to get arrested. And I was really clear about it going into this work, that I was not going to get arrested because I have children and I can't face imprisonment. But I was targeted because I was one of the leadership of the movement. And we knew that we were in the right. We knew we were in the right, that we went out there, we had permission from the landowner to stop construction. They had no right to be there. So we did what was in our legal rights, our First Amendment rights to do, and we stopped that construction out there way out in rural Atchafalaya Basin, which wasn't witnessed by anybody, unless our media was able to be there. So, so holding that over our heads was really difficult. We had to, for me, myself, personally, my story, you know, was a constant state of being ready to be have the charges pressed against us, and then having to lay out all these plans for your kids, for your business, for your work, what's going to happen to everybody. So it's very stressful. It's really undue, and it's those are some of the things that happened. And then not to mention just the trauma inflicted from the continued, I'd say, militarization and brutalization of our movement. And some of the other tactics that we used, of course, we would always reading between the lines, because there was always seemed to be a loophole in the statutes and in the infrastructure law that allowed us to continue to resist. One of those included the waterways, where we were able to continue to hold the line, because those were navigable, public navigable waterways, which they weren't prepared for us to be out there on the kayaks and stopping construction. So we had to do a lot of really creative, searching and all of this kind of these things, you know. So it was a group effort, and for real, there were so many people here that were involved. It's and representing a lot of the movement here in this work. And with the challenge to the amendments to the state's critical infrastructure law under White Hat versus Landry, we did not expect that to be coming. I didn't expect that as, I mean, it just came up so fast because they did pass that legislation, and so grateful for our friends at the Center for Constitutional Rights and Bill Quigley for stepping up and being brave to help us navigate this, you know. So without them, we would probably be in prison right now. Who knows? So I'm not sure what else to say, if there's any other questions, but that sort of paints the picture of what we've been having to live. And so right now, where it stands, from what I understand, the judge has received all of the information from both sides and is in a point of, what is it called? Anyway, to do his final judgment on the case. We're waiting for that to happen. So in the meantime, I'm working on developing a radio program on our pirate radio station to really delve into this. I was able to go to Congress and testify before Congress. So that's another strategy that we're using just to educate people and continue to do the outreach and all of this. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for sharing that troubling account, but also for lifting up the hope that you've sustained throughout you and your community. And we're building a toolbox of strategies here, right? We have, persistent messaging. We have acting in concert with journalists and litigation, but not just any type of litigation, but participatory litigation, and combating this settler empire, the settler empire at home and the settler empire abroad. And so as we build this toolbox of strategies and get a fuller picture of the persecutors, if you will, I'll move on to Joela Abione and ask Joela to describe how the state, and actually this last comment shows how it pours over from the public sphere to the private sphere, and they really go hand in hand. And so how the state and their private sort of accomplices have criminalized or persecuted dissent in the community you serve, and the impact that has had, and the strategies, importantly, that you often employ to combat this persecution.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very obvious how this country is literally drowning in anti-trans legislation as we speak. In Tennessee, the governor signing a bill that is limiting, I say it's a cross-dressing law in 2023. In Texas, the bill that they're passing September 1st, 2023, SB 1029, which is limiting all transgender people, whatever age you are, from receiving gender affirming care. The way the state is enacting a genocide on transgender people in this country is through propaganda, through manipulation tactics, and using children. Of course, children are always the go-to. Referring to a child who is receiving gender affirming care, which does not always equate to medically transitioning. Gender affirming care for children is making them feel comfortable, creating an atmosphere where the gender binary is not being shoved down their throat. But instead, what we see conservatives talking about is that we're trying to mutilate children, that we're grooming children. I mean, it's very evident, and sometimes it really makes me laugh that a country where children go to school and don't come home, a country where, I mean, the Catholic Church has murdered, I mean, in Canada, all the Indigenous children that were found underneath churches, the children who have been sexually abused that are now adults, who are now coming out, hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's just very frustrating, and I don't know, it's just misinformation, and the United States acting like they care about children, using children as a scapegoat to enact violence is the tactic the state uses, I feel, currently. And I'm sorry, the second part, I think it's in the chat, is, yeah, so the impact now is that I am a pre-K teacher in Georgia. Now, if I was to be a pre-K teacher in Tennessee, which is the state that borders Georgia, I could be arrested because I would be, I am dressing and presenting the way that is opposite to the sex I was assigned at birth. That law has not been signed yet, but it is being proposed. In Texas, adults cannot or will be shunned or will, it's very vague how they word it, but will not be able to receive gender affirming care, will not be able to receive their HRT, will not be able to receive psychiatric care, a therapist, if it pertains to their gender, their transness. The impact is that people are going to feel hopeless. People are going to start killing themselves. People are going to not have the want to live because every corner, everywhere you look is another reminder that you are not safe, that you are not loved, that you are not respected. And in terms for me, I mean,
See,
I am not, I'm sorry.
With that thought, I have strict instructions to give a CLE code at 7:15. So I'm going to announce the CLE code, which is frame 3, F as in Frank, R, A, M as in Mary, E as in exceptional 3. E as an exceptional, such as the comments made by Joela that Joela is going to continue making since I've already announced the code. So sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. But anyways, and then the third part, let me see, I'm sorry. So I started protesting in New York City in 2020 because of the lack or non-existent representation of Black Trans Lives Matter, Black Queer Lives Matter in the BLM movement that was rebirthed in New York. And now Black trans women have been doing the thing. They have been organizing, they have been galvanizing, they have been taking care of each other through numerous organizations for the girls, BTFA, but it's always been Black trans women, for Black trans women, by Black trans women, and never Black Lives Matter for Black Trans Lives Matter. And that is the disconnect that I wanted to address. And we were protesting consistently, spreading radical joy, spreading radical Black trans joy, was met with intense brutalization by New York, by the NYPD, arrested numerous times in the most brutal ways that I could imagine, as well as my fellow comrades, and being sexually assaulted by police officers, being misgendered by police officers, Black trans women being put in men's holding cells, having to beg judges, can you do something for me while I'm in here for God knows how long? And then, God forbid, you get arrested on a Friday and a woman is stuck in a men's holding cell with 20, 30 other men, you know. Oh my goodness, it was very terrifying. Of course, those were also strategies that the state was using. And then it became, with the momentum of the movement fading, because many people, you know, are sheep. They just go with the flow, whatever's convenient for them. Then we had to find ways of making the work that we were doing sustainable. And that became mutual aid and grassroots organizing. And that was my introduction to that work. And that's where I found my passion for education and wanting to teach. And so, yeah, I ended up moving down to Georgia because Georgia is like the Black trans Mecca, like down here. And being able to galvanize with the women down here, being able to create systems of care, housing, Black trans women who are owning private practices, you know, doing things that I, you know, ignorantly thought we could be nurses, we could be doctors, we can do things like this. I mean, I was just surprised that I was given an opportunity to teach children. And that is the most positive propaganda for Black trans liberation that I could think of. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And you know, for giving that harrowing account. And of course we hate that you went through that. But we're heartened to hear about how, you know, you and your comrades were able to use that persecution as a catalyst to create systems of support, right? And to create those spaces of liberation. So as we're filling up our toolbox of strategies, you know, that's one, this coalescing together and mobilizing together, and then in the wake of persecution, creating those systems of support and using that energy is very powerful. So thank you for sharing that. And so we'll shift to Gideon, and Gideon, we'll ask you again to describe how the state and its private accomplices have criminalized or persecuted the dissent of, you know, your clientele, the communities you serve, and the impact you've seen. Because, you know, as a litigator, you're there during the depositions, even when people are talking about, you know, the full impact of this persecution, this criminalization, this violence. And some of the, you know, we know about litigation, but I guess maybe some of the intricate, innovative strategies that you've seen and you've implemented in protecting and remedying the harm, protecting people from and remedying the harm of persecution.
Thank you. I just want to say first that this has been an amazing experience so far, and thank you to everyone who's spoken, who's already spoken. Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, I come from leftist lawyers. My parents are leftist lawyers. I was trained by National Lawyers Guild movement lawyers, you know, most of whom were Attica lawyers. And so what I'm doing is what they taught me to do, you know what I mean, for the most part. And I don't know how much innovation, you know, there is to share, but, you know, certainly, you know, that's where I come from, that's where I'm rooted. And so when I say, you know, I'm a leftist lawyer, I get, and I'm a solo practitioner, I, in many cases, certainly in terms of movement support cases, I get to pick my clients for the most part. And, you know, so many of the communities that I've, you know, served over the years have been different in terms of the messaging or the goals or the government response. But there's obviously a lot of common threads, especially on the government response and repression end. And unfortunately, it's no surprise that many of the tactics that are employed today are riffs on tactics that have been employed, you know, successfully and unsuccessfully, you know, by governments and the state, capital S state, and states, you know, for many years. So, you know, for me, in terms of means of persecution, you know, and clients, it's violence, right? Violence on the street, you know, and I'm focusing mostly on protests and people who are doing direct action and demonstrations in public spaces, which has been a pretty big part of my practice. You know, you're talking about violence, violent repression. You're talking about using government resources to corral people, to beat people, to cage people. So, there's violence as a means of persecution. There's often criminal charges, right? And along with criminal charges, there's getting busted, being taken into custody, being confined, in many cases being subjected to different kinds of abuse and trauma, more violence, right? And then there's often criminal charges, and in many of the cases that I've handled, they're relatively low-level criminal charges, right? People busted at a mass demonstration will frequently get what are considered violation level charges. There can still be, serious impact from violation level charges, but the scale slides very far up, right? All the way up to, from people get charged with walking in the roadway when there's a sidewalk they could be walking on in New York City at demonstrations, right? A low-level offense, or people used to get charged with being in a parade without a permit. And we fought a bunch of those cases and overturned the law, and nobody's been charged with parading without a permit since, I don't know, 2006 or, something like that. Now they charge them with walking in the street when they could be walking in the sidewalk instead. So, there's often a lot of violation level charges, and then all the way up to, domestic terrorism charges, right? And much more hate crime charges, right? Much more serious charges. So there's criminal charges. And then there's administrative civil process, right? If it's an academic institution and the client is a student, getting jammed up with student conduct code violations and other type of process that they need legal support for. And there's also things like affirmative civil litigation, right, where an organizer is targeted by the government for, I've represented some people who the government thought were behind these big bike rides back in 2005, and they sued several of them saying, you're the real leaders and you should apply for a permit, and they made a federal case of it. And so that's there's a panoply, right, of means of persecution that gets deployed in all kinds of different ways, and the impact can range from relatively minor trauma for maybe a person who's prepared and has done a risk assessment and has a lot of support, et cetera, to much greater trauma and harm, and the impact can be relatively short term, or it can be very long term. In terms of the strategies for protection, know your rights. As on the front end, being able to, am I free to leave? I do not consent to this search. I'm exercising my right to remain silent, and I'd like to speak with a lawyer. Helping people assess risks before an event, if they're thinking of engaging in different actions, helping people game out what different impacts might be and strategize about how to protect people who might be more vulnerable than others who might participate in the action. And at an action, there's a role for lawyers to do direct representation of organizers if that's something that they've asked for, to act as legal observers. And then, after an action, if there are criminal cases, there's all kinds of work to be done, from, helping people invoke their rights while they're in custody, trying to track them from arrest to release or through arraignment. If it's a person who needs medication or who, got beaten up on the street, trying to make sure that they get medical attention while they're in, and then, helping either interface with public defenders who may represent them or other people if there's legal support that's set up beforehand. And then there's the civil end, which, I say for the last, because in some ways it's the most, there's a it's ground that is more familiar, I guess, is the way that I was thinking of it. There's can be a affirmative civil litigation, to try and seek compensation, financial compensation for people who are injured, to try and seek equitable relief and policy change. And then there's, other forms of legal support, procedural challenges to rule enactments, freedom of information and records access work. So there are, I think, a lot of different strategies for protection and resistance. And, but mass defense, I think, when you're talking about large street protests, mass criminal defense, I think is especially effective, can be an especially effective tactic of resistance.
Thank you for that. I like this idea of sort of this mass defense, right? And a lot of people say participatory defense as well, in terms of like getting communities directly impacted, involved in the process of litigation. And we heard Anne speak to that some as well. And so we're about to go into the Q&A session. And I just want to give a chance for all of you to respond to what each other have said, but also to float sort of a question out there that you could choose to respond to or not. But I'm interested in us also envisioning how the state should respond to resistance, right? To collective resistance, to dissent, right? Because even if we have an ideal state, there will still be dissent, right? And there will still be communities who advocate and agitate, right? And so instead of the character assassination that Rabab has talked about, instead of the carceral strategies that Joela has talked about, instead of the enhanced criminal penalties Anne has talked about, and instead of the violence that Gideon has talked about, how should the state respond to masses of people in the street, or people challenging the extractive practices of private companies? So yeah, this is an opportunity for you to envision the ideal state state responses to such dissent. And we can go in no particular order. So whoever would like to respond, or just respond to what each other have said.
Well, I can take a stab at it. First I would say it would require a different kind of state. The current state that exists today is not capable of doing this. What the state has been doing, and I will just give some examples from our own context as a public university, state public university, that what they have tried to do is kind of construct something like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is just a cover to get more people, more of our members of our communities, indigenous, Black, people of color, and so on, to basically rubber stamp and say, we have this, because they are so worried about the litigation that Gideon is speaking about. They are so worried about it. So the main purpose is to figure out how can we get away from liability. So this state itself is only going to be able to do things if we force certain things to happen. And this is where the whole question of accountability comes in, the whole question of holding them accountable. In our case, for example, they've starved the program. Aside from the character assassination, aside from the bullying, from the intimidation, from gaslighting, it's again and again and again, and I don't even have enough time. And sometimes I don't even want to relive it and speak about it again, because it's quite painful. And we still built a very successful program. We continue with what we are doing and so on, but it doesn't stop. And every single time they'll come up with different ways to come up with different technical, bureaucratic reasons. They change the rules. Somebody spoke about, I think it was Gideon who spoke about student conduct, for example, student conduct, university. Every single day, the rules are being changed because we have to acknowledge that we are, and at the end of the day, we are dealing with a huge institution that has tons of resources. The people who are hired there are hired to actually push papers and become very creative and inventive in creating, perfect the bureaucracy that's going to be about discipline and punish. It's really about punishing people for speaking up, punishing people for resisting. The whole question of kind of like every single time they bring in the question of law and order in itself is a misnomer, because it's not really about law and order. It's about how are we going to keep people in line so they're not going to stand up and fight for their rights and speak up and so on. How can we make people radioactive? How can we isolate people? How can we put people in prison so they cannot actually afford the bail to come out and so on? I mean, all of these things, we are in a state, in a very fascist state. And I would say that we are in a fascist condition that would require for all of us to figure out what's going on. One of the things that I think really, really important for us in particular, because people say to me, but you've won. I said, yeah, we've won in 2018, we've won in 2014, we've won in 2019, we keep winning, but at the same time, they keep increasing and coming up with different ways to demoralize, to defeat, to lay so much stuff on us, to keep us busy with paperwork, to distract us and so on, because that's their function. That is what they are. This is what they're assigned to do. And this is what they need to do in order for the system to continue the way it is. So what we really need, we need more people like what Gideon is speaking about, what people from here, from the Colloquium, from the law school, from various places, we've gotten amazing support from Palestine Legal, for Center for Constitutional Rights, National Lawyers Guild, and I can't even stop. We don't have enough time to talk about all of it, but we don't have enough. We don't have enough lawyers who are standing by. We don't have enough people to come in. And basically, like, I really would like people to come in and review the whole case from A to Z and find out what's going on and how they keep coming up with all these creative things. We need people to come in and submit a lot of FOIA, public record requests. And when they submit it, say to them, no, this is not actually what we asked for. You're giving us something that's actually not really the reality. You're giving us all of the smoke screen stuff that basically deflects attention from what's really going on. How can we actually do that? Because part of it, then the challenge is how to make that shared with other people. How can we make it shared with other people? Because also one of the things they say, oh, we're a public institution, we have no money, and so on. And we say, so how come you keep giving more raises to the presidents, to all the administrators and so on, and you cut down and you fire the lecturers, the people who have no jobs? How come you don't give them any health benefits? How come you increase the work of the counselors and so on and so forth? All of this stuff is happening every single day, and it's happening across the board. So I think we really need to have collective strategies, and we really need to have more people who are coming out of law schools who are willing to come in and take on these things, study them, understand them, because some of this we understand, some of it we don't. We'll learn something, and then the next case comes up, we'll still have to demystify it and learn it and so on. So this is one of the biggest frustrating things, that we really need to basically hold the state at bay. And because now the state is no longer the social welfare state. We're no longer facing the social welfare state that is supposed to take care of its people. I don't want to even say citizens, because not everybody is a citizen and so on. The population, how is it? They're not fulfilling that role. They are fulfilling the role of repressing us. How can we actually come together in order to hold them accountable?
Definitely. And so what I'm hearing here is also sort of, in addition to envisioning sort of a better future, we have very real needs now, right? And so how do we meet those needs now? So yeah, I invite all of you to either, do this, engage in this process of envisioning, a state that responds to the dissent in a different way, or to just give voice to what needs you see that aren't being met right now.
I can take a minute to respond to this. You know, Indigenous folks here in the country have been dealing with this for a long time with this government, the colonized government that basically is set to subjugate Indigenous people and in a quest to take our lands. So this is nothing new to us, okay? We've been living with this for a long time. We know their tactics. We've been living with this. And I also agree. I agree with Rabab that I don't think what we have in place now is not going to ever do justice for us. Not for me as an Indigenous woman and not for my children, okay? It's not been just for my ancestors, but we know this and we continue to stand up and take and fight for what is right, because we come from warrior cultures, and I'm not trying to sound like, you know, all flowery or whatever about it, but this is how some of us were raised, okay? If you're born Indigenous in this country, you're automatically politicized. We don't have a choice. And we all automatically understand that this government system will never, ever do anything to help us as Indigenous people. So fighting against this and trying to find a way where they're actually going to be helpful for us, I think it needs to be done all over again. And the resistance, I think it needs to be more like, you know, we need more coordination, and we need some folks to come in from that, like from what y'all are doing with the studying of the law, and we need people who are willing to try to step into this system to change it from the inside. But, you know, I really don't have any faith in it. I don't have no faith that this is good, that there's a strategy to actually work for us and in our favor. So I hope that this group of folks that are here listening to us today, that you take this to heart and help us figure this out, you know, because ultimately, you know, the ultimate decision maker out of all of what we're doing right now is Mother Earth. Okay, she'll be the final decision maker for all of us if we don't stand up and protect her and her the destruction of her, because she's the one that sustains us. So ultimately, I think that's we have to return back to Indigenous governance systems. But the system that we have right now, I don't think it's going to help us.
So yeah, and that goes off of Rabab's, or builds on Rabab's point. And so maybe seems like it is the case that, you know, the state as constituted might not be or isn't equipped to handle sort of the issues that your communities are mobilizing around with the care it deserves. And so while meeting the immediate needs in terms of more lawyers, we also have a duty to be innovative in the way that we envision our interventions. So I want to open it up for questions, since we have about 18 minutes left. And so I'm not entirely sure how to do that. But yeah, Jesseline, how are we doing questions? Okay, we have a question in the chat. So they're posting questions in the chat now. So everybody, please ask questions. All right, so this is for the entire panel, whoever would like to take it, this question. The question is, how can we best practice radical love in the face of unjust state oppression? How can we best practice radical love in the face of unjust state oppression?
I'd like to answer this one. I would say the best way to practice radical love for me is through community, is through the people that resemble the same experience that I do, the people who affirm my existence, my womanhood, my soul, and the people who can also hold me accountable in the same breath. The people who surround myself by patience and empathy and compassion, allowing myself to not be ignorant towards situations, giving in to, like how Anne was saying, you know, Mother Earth, you know, giving into her wisdom, giving into her teaching, that will help me be able to then look at myself in the mirror and say that I love who I see, that I also affirm the person that I see. Because at the end of the day, you know, you can be surrounded by love, but it won't mean anything if I'm not feeling it within myself. And yeah, I think that's very radical. I mean, transgender people loving themselves, transgender people loving each other, transgender people loving each other outwardly, that in itself is very radical.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Others, how can we best practice radical love in the face of unjust state oppression?
I can just say one sentence if Gideon or the other colleagues don't want to say. I would just say that I think this framework of the indivisibility of justice, of thinking that justice is indivisible, that any victory for any of our communities is a victory of us. We don't have to benefit directly from it. We don't need to think of it as transnational, but to really feel the pain and the joy of what is happening, that here, paying a lot, like I learned a lot today from my colleagues, and I've been involved with so many struggles for so many years, you know, kind of like, including withstanding work, water protectors, prisoners, and so on. But I think to kind of like think about that, that we don't really have to every single time somebody is having a struggle and so on, we don't really need to insert ourselves. It's okay for us to sometimes be silent and listen and be in the awe of the moment. So when George Floyd was martyred, all of our communities needed to, and all of communities did jump in and support and say, what do you need? This is what we're going to do. Basically, what do you need? Don't question, don't ask, don't come in and school people, don't give recipes when you really don't know what the community exactly needs. Whatever the community is in question is, that's what we do. We just go and we protect and we support and we have each other's backs. When people get protected, we have each other's backs. This is the fact of people taking the phone and taking pictures, people saying what's going on, people calling lawyers. I mean, this is the stuff we don't really need to be invited to participate. Sometimes we do because we don't know, because there is so much information out there, but we don't really need to. We need to jump in and make sure that people are feeling that they can struggle, because the minute people feel that they are all alone, this is one of the major tools our oppressors want. They want us to stop feeling solidarity and feel isolated. And it's really, really, really important not to do that, because people get power from movement, get power from each other, get power from supporting the various struggles.
I would offer just really simply to sort of build on that is simply just show up, okay? In whatever way that you can. Do not show up, but we really need folks to show up in whatever capacity that they can. And that is radical. And that is like showing some really radical love if you're not afraid to show up, and don't be scared to do it.
All right. Another question we have is, how can movements sustain momentum in the face of constant suppression? How do we make these struggles sustainable for individuals and groups? And I'll add in there sort of what sustains you in the work as you're dealing with the suppression. But the question is, how can movements sustain momentum in the face of constant suppression?
For me, I think as people, we're constantly evolving, and I think our actions also need to evolve with the times, with the resources that we have at the present moment. And yeah, for me, like I was saying before, you know, it was easier to do Occupy, for example, in New York. I was a part of the Abolition Park, the Occupy City Hall. It was easier to do that with the tens of thousands of people that were standing behind us. And then as the numbers dwindled, well, why we occupied City Hall was to address the unhoused community in New York City. They're still unhoused, and we have nobody behind us anymore except for our core group of people. Do we just go home? No, you know? And so then it became, okay, there's thousands of empty apartment buildings in New York City, just there, enough to fill 3 times the population of unhoused people in New York. How are we gonna get them in there? So then it became occupying the empty hotels, a small group of people. I mean, and I think understanding that I'd rather have 5 people next to me that I trust that are down with the cause than 5 million behind me that are just up in the air. And then it became, okay, there's so many abolitionist farms upstate in New York that are not only Black owned, but working with the indigenous tribes that they're farming on their land and are in connection. Now, how do we get in connection with them? And so, yeah, I think the best way to continue momentum as we see, you know, not many eyes on us. Well, there's always eyes on us, but not many people. Okay, people stop reposting, people stop sharing, people stop showing up like how they used to. But the way that the movement keeps on happening is community, is finding people, is finding your how you say, your pod. That's how we used to, when we were in Abolition Park, we had a pod. We had, you know, people who, because we all have different opinions, we all have different ways of going about how we want to do direct action. So finding people that we gravitate towards, being in a pod, but still being in community with each other, that we understand that we do have different ideas, we do have different ways of approaching a situation. And I think just that community communication and community building is the best way to make a movement sustainable.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. All right, and so as we have about 8 minutes left, you know, you have a sort of, you still have an audience of law students and a broader community right now. And so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to, you know, provide concluding remarks to this audience and reflections on our conversation and marching orders, if you will.
Well, I have with me Michael Ratner's 4 key principles of being a radical lawyer. So if I can offer those. Michael Ratner is lived like him. Michael Ratner was a past president of the National Lawyers Guild and of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and a really great radical lawyer. And I took this picture of his 4 key principles of being a radical lawyer from the center. It's up in the Center for Constitutional Rights kitchen. So I print it out every once in a while The 4 key principles are: do not refuse to take a case just because it has long odds of winning in court. Use cases to publicize a radical critique of US policy and to promote revolutionary transformation. Combine legal work with political advocacy. And finally, love people. So I couldn't say it better than Michael Ratner. So that's my contribution.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that intervention.
I could go next. I would just actually want to say that it was really radical lawyers who really saved my life. Michael Ratner, Bill Kunstler, Lenny Weinglass, Arthur Kenoy, Wilhelm Joseph, the lawyers from the National Conference of Black Lawyers. I mean, they really supported us, the movement, and I would say personally too, I have tons of stories that I would not get into, but I would just say that one of the things that are really, really important, and in my personal experience, is that because we keep getting attacked and people think that we've won, people seem to drop, and there is, battle fatigue. People get tired and so on. And this is when the people who are oppressing us are actually using it to maybe send the worst strike, the last blow, because this is it. They wear us out. It's just, they wear us out. It's war of attrition. One of my colleagues, my president of the union, calls it death by 10,000 cuts. They keep at it. They keep at you. They keep at you. They keep at you. And then at one point, people say, okay, well, we've done all of the stuff we've done here. We need to move on to something else. So, but they do not realize that at that point, this is when people who have failed all these years now are going to come back and basically say, how can we deal the last blow and basically finish the struggle once and for all? So I'm kind of like the marching orders, and I'm also reminded by one saying, when somebody said to me that causes movements go to court to die, to the courtroom to die, but they don't all die. Some don't die because people mobilize, people organize, people mobilize and become, whether it is the Central Park 5, whether it is the Chicago 7, that's why we learned it. That's why we know these cases, because they are the ones that people came together. How can we make more cases? These cases, I know also even with the Standing Rock, it was actually all this struggle and so on. And then people kept struggling, and then pushed back. So, and they'll come back again. So I think it's really, really important for people who are in law school today, who are watching and so on, and with the lawyers who are there and so on, abide by the 4 principles that Gideon shared by Michael Lerner. Stand by us. Do not abandon us, because it becomes really, really hard to feel radioactive and to feel very isolated. We really need to defend against new McCarthyism and stop these forces from actually crushing us.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have about 30 seconds each for Anne and Joela, because we have to conclude this conference at 7:57. So 30 seconds each.
I would encourage y'all who are watching to join us sometimes on the front line if you get a minute to come and see what we're actually facing, right? Don't be afraid to come and join us. And telling you, they try to kill us out there. So we really need your expertise and your willingness to protect us in these court systems, right? So they don't lock us away like they do and turn us into political prisoners like Leonard Peltier, So those are the things that we need you to do to help us. Check.
Thank you. And Joela, to wrap us up in about 30 seconds.
Okay, I will be quick. I would say, instead of focusing on your precise label that you have, focus on your function, focus on your capabilities, and just, you have the opportunity to clear pathways for more transformative social change. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I'll give you a big round of applause, and I'll turn it over to Sierra. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much to our panelists and all of our moderators for your time, for being here and for sharing these really amazing perspectives and insights. I really wanted to say how much I appreciate the way you wove together these distinct but overlapping struggles. For me, that's something that really resonates, really reflects my own political journey. So thank you for leading us in this path to liberation. This does conclude our colloquium. So thank you again to all of our panelists and moderators for sharing their work, their reflections, insights, and calls to action with us. Thank you as well to our live captioners, our interpreters for helping to make this event more accessible. And thank you to our partners, our many student groups, co-sponsors, and all of our student volunteers for making this event possible. A recording and transcript for both sessions will be available shortly at socialchangenyu.com. We also hope that some of our amazing panelists will submit written pieces to our digital companion, The Harbinger, and we'll definitely email you when that comes out. And to conclude, we just hope that this event can be a call to action and solidarity, that it can remind us of the forces that liberation work faces and the power that comes from collective work. So thank you to all who shared their wisdom, their lived experience and perspective over these past 2 days. We hope that the Take Action resource provided via email and crowdsourced from our panelists supports you in translating the ideas and examples shared over the last 2 days into action in your own work and communities. Thank you and good night.